Here's a question that sounds simple until you really think about it. Did ancient women want to get pregnant every single time they could? And before you answer that, here is a follow-up question that is going to make this video significantly more interesting. Did ancient humans even fully understand that sex caused pregnancy in the first place? Because here's the thing, and this is the part that tends to make people stop and stare at the ceiling for a moment, the connection between sex and pregnancy is genuinely not obvious. Not inherently, not automatically. The gap between cause and effect is 9 months long. 9 months is an enormous stretch of time in a world where most of your mental energy is consumed by the immediate and urgent business of finding food, avoiding predators, and keeping yourself and the people around you alive long enough to see tomorrow. The idea that what you did nearly a year ago is directly responsible for the infant currently screaming and making your life significantly more complicated requires a level of sustained abstract reasoning and pattern recognition that is not trivial. You have to hold two events in your mind simultaneously, recognize a causal link between them across a 9-month gap, and do this consistently enough across multiple pregnancies and multiple women in your group to establish it as reliable knowledge rather than superstition or coincidence. That is a genuinely hard cognitive task, and the evidence suggests that not every ancient human population had completed it. There are documented cases of modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups studied by anthropologists in the 20th century, who had maintained substantial isolation from the broader world, where the connection between sex and pregnancy was not culturally established, where people simply did not understand, as a community, that intercourse caused babies. They attributed pregnancy to other forces entirely: spirits entering the body during sleep, eating certain foods, visiting certain sacred locations, bathing in particular rivers. These are not stories about stupidity. These are stories about how genuinely difficult it is to establish causation across a 9-month gap without any of the scientific tools we take for granted. And they tell us something important about the baseline from which ancient human reproductive knowledge had to develop. But we are going further than that today. We are going to look at whether ancient humans, the ones living 50,000, 100,000, even 200,000 years ago, long before civilization existed to have opinions about reproduction, had any concept of controlling when they had children. Whether they developed methods. Whether those methods actually worked, and what the whole complicated business of family planning looked like when the only tools available were the human body, the natural world, and knowledge passed mouth to mouth between people who had no writing, no doctors, no clinical trials, and no pharmacy within 100,000 years of existing. Let's start with the big question sitting underneath everything else in this video. Did ancient humans understand that sex caused pregnancy? The honest answer is, we cannot know for certain, and the evidence that exists is more complicated and more interesting than most people expect. Here's why the connection is genuinely not obvious, and why it deserves more respect as a cognitive achievement than it typically gets. Ovulation in human females is concealed. Unlike many other primates, human females show no clear external signal of when they are fertile. There is no visible swelling, no dramatic color change, no unmistakable behavioral announcement that broadcasts to everyone in the group that this female is currently capable of conception. This concealed ovulation is actually unusual in the primate world, and appears to be an evolved feature of human biology, though researchers continue to debate exactly why it evolved and what evolutionary advantage it provided to our ancestors. The practical consequence of concealed ovulation is that even a highly observant ancient human paying close attention to the relationship between sex and pregnancy was working with extremely noisy data. A woman might have sex many times over many months without becoming pregnant, and then become pregnant seemingly at random. The probability of conception from a single act of intercourse is actually relatively low, even under optimal fertility conditions, somewhere around 15 to 25% per cycle for a fertile couple. You could observe sex happening regularly in a small band of ancient humans without seeing any obvious one-to-one correspondence with pregnancies appearing 9 months later. Add to this the absence of any way to track dates, record observations, or compare notes across time in a systematic way, and the challenge becomes clearer. Establishing that sex causes pregnancy requires connecting two events separated by 9 months. In a context where you have no calendar, no writing, no ability to record your observations, and where the confounding variables, some women getting pregnant quickly, others not for months, some not at all, make the pattern genuinely difficult to read. And yet, the evidence suggests that most ancient human populations did eventually arrive at this understanding, probably over thousands of years of accumulated observation passed between generations. Some researchers argue that ancient humans figured out the connection earlier than we might expect, and that evidence of this understanding shows up in some of the oldest human art ever discovered. The Venus figurines, small carved female figures with dramatically exaggerated pregnant bellies, heavy breasts, and wide hips, found across Europe and parts of Asia and dating to roughly 35,000 to 11,000 years ago, have been interpreted by some archaeologists as evidence that ancient people understood, valued, and sought to represent female reproductive capacity. If ancient humans were deliberately carving objects that celebrate pregnancy as a specific physical state, the argument goes, they almost certainly had some understanding of what produced that state. Other researchers push back. The figurines, they argue, could represent ideals of beauty, objects of spiritual significance, and representations of female power that don't require specific knowledge about the biology of conception. The figurines tell us that ancient humans found female bodies meaningful and worth representing in durable form. They don't tell us definitively what those humans understood about what made a female body pregnant. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. By the time Homo sapiens had been living in organized social groups for tens of thousands of years, accumulating knowledge and passing it across generations, some meaningful understanding of the relationship between sex and pregnancy had almost certainly developed in most populations. That understanding may have been incomplete. It may have been entangled with spiritual and magical explanations that coexisted alongside the practical observation. It may have varied significantly between groups living in different environments with different social structures. But the basic observation that women who engage in sex sometimes become pregnant and women who entirely abstain never do is the kind of pattern that sustained human attention across generations would eventually detect and retain. Ancient humans were extraordinarily good observers of the natural world. Their survival depended on it. Fertility patterns in their own community were not outside the scope of that observation. Before we get to methods, let's spend a moment on motivation. Because understanding why ancient humans might have wanted to prevent or space out pregnancies is just as important as understanding how they went about it. And the reasons are more compelling and more practical than most people assume. The life of an ancient mother carrying or nursing a very young infant was dramatically harder than the life of an ancient woman without a dependent child. Hunter-gatherer life required near constant mobility. Ancient bands moved with the seasons, following food sources, tracking animal migrations, avoiding areas that had been depleted or made dangerous. A heavily pregnant woman, or a woman carrying a nursing infant too young to walk independently, was less mobile, less able to cover ground quickly, less able to contribute fully to the foraging activities that kept everyone fed. In conditions where the group needed to move fast, fleeing a predator, relocating from a resource that had failed, moving away from a rival group, a woman with a newborn infant was genuinely constrained in ways that created real risk for herself, her infant, and the group as a whole. But the more immediate and practical problem was this. Having a new infant arrive before an existing child was old enough to eat solid food and move independently was a serious physiological and logistical problem. In a world without infant formula, without supplementary feeding options for babies, without any way to nourish an infant except breast milk, a new pregnancy arriving too soon after the previous birth created an impossible situation. The existing nursing infant would need to be weaned abruptly before it was ready, losing the nutritional support and immune protection that breast milk provided at a critical stage of development. The mother's body would simultaneously be trying to support a new pregnancy while still recovering from the previous one and potentially still nursing. The strain on her body was considerable, and the risk to both the existing child and the new pregnancy was real. This is not theoretical. The evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied by anthropologists shows that birth spacing in these groups averages around 3 to 4 years, significantly wider than the spacing typical in agricultural or industrial societies. Ancient women on average had somewhere between 4 and 6 children over their entire reproductive lives, far fewer than the biological maximum if they were conceiving as frequently as their physiology would allow. Some of that spacing happened naturally, without deliberate intent, through mechanisms we will discuss shortly. But some of it, the evidence strongly suggests, was deliberately managed by ancient women and their communities using every tool available to them. The question is, what were those tools? The single most powerful natural pregnancy prevention mechanism available to ancient women required no knowledge of botany, no preparation of any substance, and no deliberate planning whatsoever. It was breastfeeding, and it was far more effective than most modern people realize. Extended intensive breastfeeding, nursing a child frequently and on demand, around the clock, throughout the day and night, suppresses ovulation through a well-understood hormonal mechanism called lactational amenorrhea. When a woman nurses frequently and intensively, the hormonal signals involved in milk production actively interfere with the hormonal cascade that drives the menstrual cycle, preventing ovulation from occurring and therefore preventing pregnancy entirely. The effect is most reliable under specific conditions. Nursing must be frequent, the infant must be receiving no supplementary food sources, and the mother's overall caloric intake and body fat must be relatively low. All of these conditions were standard in an ancient hunter-gatherer context. Ancient women nursed their infants constantly and on demand. There was no supplementary food available for infants who couldn't eat solid food yet. Ancient women in mobile foraging bands were lean and physically active in ways that kept body fat low. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations living in conditions similar to ancient ones show that exclusive breastfeeding under these circumstances can suppress ovulation for 18 months to 3 years or longer. 3 years of effective contraception from a single physiological process requiring no deliberate intervention whatsoever. This single mechanism is almost certainly responsible for a large portion of the naturally wide birth spacing observed in ancient populations. Ancient women didn't need to understand the hormonal mechanism to use it deliberately. They would have observed, over generations, that women who nursed their infants extensively and for longer periods went longer before becoming pregnant again. That observation, which didn't require any knowledge of hormones or ovulation, was enough to inform behavior. Nursing longer kept pregnancies further apart. That pattern was learnable and teachable without any understanding of why it was true. But lactational amenorrhea is not perfectly reliable, particularly as an infant grows older, begins receiving some solid food, and nurses less frequently. At some point, the cycle returns. Pregnancy becomes possible again, and ancient women who understood the connection between sex and pregnancy and who had reason to want more time before the next child would have faced the question of what else they could do. This is where the evidence becomes fragmentary and requires careful interpretation, because ancient populations left no written records and physical evidence for specific pregnancy prevention practices before the emergence of settled civilization is genuinely difficult to recover. What we can do is look carefully at the earliest written records of contraceptive knowledge, recognize that those practices did not appear from nowhere the moment someone invented writing, and reason backward to what ancient women likely knew based on both the pharmacological properties of plants available in ancient environments and the patterns of knowledge transmission that characterize human communities. The earliest written medical documents describing contraception are ancient Egyptian texts. The Ebers papyrus from around 1550 BCE and the Kahun papyrus from around 1850 BCE. These texts describe a variety of substances used to prevent pregnancy. Acacia gum features prominently in these descriptions, and this detail is significant for reasons that go beyond historical curiosity. Modern laboratory analysis has confirmed that acacia gum has genuine pharmacologically active spermicidal properties. It breaks down in the presence of moisture into lactic acid, the same active compound found in many modern commercial spermicidal preparations. Ancient Egyptian women inserting acacia gum-based preparations were not engaging in magical thinking. They were using a substance with real biological activity against sperm. The critical point is that the Egyptian medical texts did not represent new discoveries made possible by civilization. They represented the formalization and written recording of knowledge that had been accumulating in human communities for far longer than writing had existed. Plant medicine knowledge in human populations is ancient beyond the reach of any written record. Evidence of deliberate medicinal plant use has been tentatively identified at sites associated with Neanderthals, dating to 50,000 years or more before the present. The knowledge of which plants affected human physiology, which reduced fever, which eased pain, which affected fertility, would have been learned through observation and experiment, transmitted across generations of humans, and refined over timescales that make the Egyptian medical texts look recent by comparison. Several plants with documented contraceptive or abortifacient properties were present in ancient environments across different parts of the world, available to ancient humans long before civilization existed to write about them. Wild carrot, known today as Queen Anne's lace, produces seeds that have been shown in modern pharmacological studies to interfere with implantation by blocking the production of progesterone. Traditional use of wild carrot seeds as a post-coital contraceptive has been documented in communities in India and parts of Europe, where the knowledge was maintained as folk medicine passed between women across generations. Wild carrot is native to Europe and Asia and would have been present in the environments where ancient humans lived. Pennyroyal, a member of the mint family widespread across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, contains compounds called pulegone and pulegol that can stimulate uterine contractions and have abortifacient effects. Pennyroyal has been used medicinally across cultures for thousands of years, appearing in ancient Greek, Roman, and medieval European medical traditions as a substance that could provoke menstruation and end early pregnancies. The plant was there. The effects were observable. The knowledge existed long before anyone wrote it down. Silphium deserves special mention because its story illustrates just how seriously ancient people took plant-based contraception. Silphium was a species of giant fennel native to the coastal region around Cyrene in what is now Libya. It was so valued in the ancient Greek and Roman world for its contraceptive properties, described by ancient writers including Soranus and Dioscorides as highly effective at preventing pregnancy, that it was harvested into extinction within a few centuries of being extensively exploited. A plant was hunted to extinction because ancient people valued its contraceptive effects that much. That level of demand doesn't emerge from a population that has only recently discovered plant-based contraception. It reflects knowledge and practices with roots going back much further. The knowledge of which plants affected fertility, which could delay or prevent pregnancy, which could end an early pregnancy, which needed to be consumed in what form and at what point in the cycle, was almost certainly part of the accumulated practical wisdom that ancient communities maintained and transmitted with careful attention. This knowledge lived in memory and in practice, and in the conversations between older women and younger ones, passed across generations through observation and teaching and experience, accumulating and refining itself over thousands of years before civilization arrived and someone thought to chisel it onto papyrus. There is another dimension to ancient reproductive management that tends to get overlooked entirely, and it changes the picture significantly. Ancient women almost certainly paid close attention to their own bodies in ways that gave them practical information about fertility cycles, even without any formal scientific framework for understanding what those cycles meant biologically. The menstrual cycle, roughly 28 days recurring with relative regularity, accompanied by physical signs that a woman living closely with her own body would notice, is the kind of pattern that human intelligence is extraordinarily well suited to detect. In a world without artificial light, living in close synchrony with natural rhythms, in small groups of women whose cycles may have naturally synchronized through the close proximity, awareness of cyclical patterns in female fertility was not difficult to develop. Some researchers have proposed that early tally marks found carved on ancient artifacts, small sequential notches that appear on bone and ivory objects dating back tens of thousands of years, may represent early attempts at tracking lunar or menstrual cycles. The most famous of these is the Ishango bone, a baboon fibula found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and dating to roughly 20,000 years ago, which bears notch patterns that some researchers have interpreted as a lunar calendar or menstrual tracking device. The interpretation remains debated. The patterns could represent many things, but the underlying logic is compelling. Ancient humans tracked patterns. Cycles mattered to survival. The menstrual cycle was a pattern that mattered specifically to the women experiencing it and to the communities around them. If ancient women understood, even imprecisely, that their fertility followed a predictable cycle, that there were times in that cycle when pregnancy was more likely, and times when it was less likely, then timing-based approaches to pregnancy prevention become possible without any special plant preparations or substances. Avoiding sex during the perceived fertile period requires only observation, pattern recognition, and the ability to communicate that knowledge within the community. All of these were things ancient humans were extraordinarily good at. There is also the practice of deliberate abstinence, which appears in anthropological accounts of modern hunter-gatherer societies as a recognized and socially supported reproductive management strategy. Some ancient communities maintained explicit cultural expectations around birth spacing. Social norms that couples would avoid pregnancy while an existing child was still nursing and dependent, backed by community knowledge about why birth spacing mattered and community support for the behavioral choices that achieved it. These norms represent something important: socially organized family planning, existing within ancient communities long before civilization arrived to formalize such things in law or religion. They required no writing, no formal institutions, no professional class of healers. They required only collective human intelligence applied to a problem that every member of the community had reasons to care about. Now let's address the part of ancient reproductive management that is uncomfortable but cannot honestly be left out. Infanticide, the deliberate killing of newborns, is documented across virtually every human culture ever studied by anthropologists, including hunter-gatherer societies living in conditions comparable to ancient ones. It was a practice of last resort used in specific circumstances where the community could not support the infant. Newborns born with severe physical conditions that would prevent their survival. Infants born during periods of extreme resource scarcity when the group was already at the edge of what it could sustain. Infants born too soon after a previous child when the mother genuinely could not nurse two. Infants whose birth circumstances created risks the community judged it could not manage. This is deeply difficult to sit with, and it should be. But omitting it would misrepresent the reality of what ancient reproductive management actually looked like in its full complexity. In a world without the means to support every infant that arrived, decisions about which newborns to raise were made under conditions of genuine necessity by communities and by mothers who had no other options available to them. The anthropological evidence from modern hunter-gatherer groups that still face similar pressures suggests consistently that infanticide in these communities is experienced as a painful, serious, and morally weighted decision, not a casual or indifferent one. These were not communities that placed low value on children. The evidence from the same communities shows that children who were accepted and raised were cared for with enormous investment and genuine affection. The decision to not raise a specific infant was made precisely because of the community's awareness of what it took to raise a child successfully and an honest assessment that those conditions could not be met in that specific case. The point is not that ancient humans were callous toward infant life. The evidence does not support that conclusion. The point is that ancient reproductive management was real, it was serious, it was engaged with at every stage of the reproductive process using every tool available, and it operated within social frameworks that recognized the community's genuine stake in reproductive outcomes in ways that modern individualistic societies may find unfamiliar. Here is the perspective that all of this builds toward, and it is one worth sitting with seriously. We have a persistent cultural tendency to imagine ancient women as entirely passive in relation to their own biology. Endlessly pregnant, endlessly at the mercy of reproductive processes they had no power to understand or influence, waiting for civilization to arrive and hand them options. That image is not accurate. It is a projection of assumptions onto people who deserve more credit than that. Ancient women breastfed their children extensively and for long periods, leveraging the most powerful natural fertility suppression mechanism available to them in ways that were almost certainly at least partly deliberate. They accumulated and transmitted knowledge of plants with genuine pharmacological activity affecting fertility, knowledge that was old before the first medical text was ever written. They observed and tracked their own body's cycles with the attention that people pay to things that matter to their survival. Their communities developed social norms around birth spacing that served reproductive management functions, creating collective frameworks that supported individual choices about when to have children. The tools they had were limited compared to what is available today. The knowledge was incomplete, entangled with spiritual frameworks, varying between communities and across time. The options in moments of genuine crisis were brutal by any modern standard. None of that changes the essential truth. Ancient women were active agents in managing their own reproduction, using intelligence, observation, accumulated knowledge, and community support in a world that provided nothing easy and demanded everything in return. The desire to have children on terms that the community and the individual could sustain, and the human ingenuity brought to bear on that desire, did not begin with civilization. It began with us. Long before any of the things we built came to exist,